Okay, today we're talking about duty ethics and utilitarian ethics, and maybe values if we get that far. Duty ethics, this is a view that ethics consists of obeying certain rules arising out of duties which are themselves universal moral maxims. So this is Kant's duty ethics, and it's one of the main theories of ethics, along with virtue ethics and utilitarianism. Okay, so we already talked about virtue ethics last time. Now we're talking about duty ethics. So the rightness of an act is determined by whether it is required, permitted, or prohibited. And so that's duty ethics. That's one. Two, people are to be treated as ends and not means under this system. Sounds good. Three, moral obligation doesn't change over time, place, or circumstances. So it's universal. Pretty much all the Enlightenment systems of ethics are. Primacy of rules. All persons are rational and therefore able to know and live up to the rules which do not change from person to person. Motive is important. An act isn't ethical unless it is done for the right reason. Duties must be followed even where the result of doing so is disastrous. Categorical imperative. So Kant expressed the essence of his ethical system in concepts, and his ethical concepts and statements usually referred to as formulas or imperatives. Each of these formulas expresses actually a more complex rendering of the golden rule when you think about it. So you know the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This simple rule has appeared in one form or another in great civilizations throughout the world. Anthropologists now suggest that trust and cooperation, teamwork, is every bit as essential to a group's success as selfishness and competitiveness. And so sometimes this is expressed as I expressed it, in the positive way. Most of the time in our society that's the way it's expressed. But you'll find in some societies it might be expressed in the negative. Don't do unto others as you wouldn't want done to yourself. That's a negative expression of the rule. But we usually talk about in a more positive kind of way. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It suggests a certain degree of charity, doesn't it? And, and of course there's some people who will jokingly refer to the golden rule as he who has the gold makes the rules, which of course is a joke. But what we're interested in here is the golden rule, and we're going to compare it to Kant's two categorical imperatives, see how they stack up together. Now his formulas are a little more abstract, and so the first formulation is that you are to act as if, the first categorical imperative is the first formulation is act as if the principle of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. Would you want this act to be the rule by which your community is governed? Is this how you want people behaving towards you? And of course, that fits the golden rule, doesn't it? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So that's his first expression of his categorical imperatives. The second formulation: act in such a way that you always treat people, whether yourself or others, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. Don't merely use people to accomplish goals you have. You must also consider their needs and situations, basically. Autonomy. Kant put a premium on the individual's freedom to choose, his maxims intending them as a guideline for all to exercise their free will. So free will is important to him, and autonomy, that is, being your own individual self, being who you are, being authentic, you could say even. Lying to another prevents him from choosing rightly because of whether you think he will act wrongly or not. You must allow him the chance to choose. So that's giving him autonomy. So if a drug dealer shows up at your door and he's looking for your roommate, and you know your roommate has been using drugs and it seems like maybe he's not paid, why else would this guy be there? He's demanding to know where your roommate is. And you realize that your roommate is actually hiding somewhere in your apartment. He climbed up into a cabinet above the sink, a very small cabinet, and he hopes to evade discovery there. And you tell him you don't know where he is, and he forces his way in, looks around, and you're a little concerned. If he finds him, he may kill him, but not only that, but he might kill you for not telling him. So it is a problem, you know. But you would decide that you can't disclose who he is. Well, basically, you're lying to him. I don't know where he is. It's not the truth. A lot of people would say you're justified in doing that, but Kant would say you're never justified to do this. You have to give him the opportunity to do the right thing. Well, that's very idealistic, and Kant was very idealistic. Consequences or results. Kantian ethics, in Kantian ethics, an ethical person need not consider the consequences of his actions so long as he acted with goodwill and intended no evil. His hands are clean, in contrast to utilitarianism. Therefore, one is never justified in lying, but must tell the truth, even when he believes or knows that evil will result. Okay, now the English, during their long war with the Spanish, when Queen Elizabeth was in power, sought to defeat the Spanish, which had a lot of money and could build a lot of ships and had actually a more powerful navy than the British at that time, commissioned privateers to take ships of the Spanish, oftentimes that were carrying gold. So, you know, in this way they were able to keep the Spanish warships maybe busy protecting the gold shipments from the New World to Spain. And they were, you know, commissioned, and they were agreed to retire from piracy at the end of the war. So she commissioned privateers. Privateers are pirates. And they didn't retire, but continued as pirates after the war. The English Navy had to track them down at substantial cost. So it kind of backfired in some ways on them. Emotion. Kant believed that the emotions happen to us, and therefore we need to ignore, suppress, and deny them. In Kantian ethics, rationality is cold, unclouded by feelings. In contrast, virtue ethic demands that we train ourselves to have an esprit de corps. The excellence of our spirit deters evil acts and fosters positive emotions connected to doing so. So, let's see, this is contrast with virtue ethics, which in some ways says, actually, you know, Kant actually seemed to think that people who wanted to do evil but were able to fight off the temptation were in better shape. Whereas with virtue ethics, as we said before, the person is thought to be truly virtuous who is not tempted to do the wrong thing, but is happy to do the right thing. And you know, a person who has difficulty doing the right thing may be weak and may, in some time in the future, might actually go the other way. And so that's why they think that. Anyway, in contrast, virtue ethic demands that we train ourselves to have a spirit of excellence and to foster positive emotions connected to doing good and experiencing those. You know, so virtue ethics is all in doing the virtuous acts. Conflicted motivation. In Kantian ethics, the individual who desires to do wrong but successfully overcomes temptation is deemed more praiseworthy than if he had not been tempted. The opposite of virtue ethics, where excellence involves training to align our emotions with the right course of action. So with virtue ethics, you need to train to have that higher spirit where you're going to do it. You need to practice your ethics. And, you know, Kantian ethics basically is praising this conflicted individual. Conflicted individual would be a person who does the right thing, but only after a struggle. And, you know, that becomes obvious. And so, generally speaking, when we realize a person is conflicted about doing the right thing, we no longer tend to trust them. So it's not really good in that sense. And so I use as an example there are two people who come across a valuable necklace laying on the ground outside of a jewelry store. One of them is a nun who's devoted her life to a life of poverty, taking care of poor people, Mother Teresa. And she has no difficulty and is happy to pick it up and take it into the jewelry shop because she believes that the jeweler might know whose it is. And so she seeks to find who the real owner is of the necklace. The other individual is Captain Jack Sparrow, the famous pirate of the Caribbean, and he is used to taking these kinds of items off of passengers and ships. And so he's tempted to take this. He doesn't at first think about turning it in, but after a while he thinks, well, somebody may actually want this and it might have some personal value to them. So he decides to turn it in, but after only a great struggle. So after a great struggle, he's able to turn it in. That's a conflicted individual. And Kant would say, well, he deserves more credit for it than Mother Teresa, who found it easy to do. She was not tempted. Whereas virtue ethics says, no, it's all about the training. And a person who's trained himself and done these acts before and continues to do these things is the one who has the true virtue. Conflicted individual is perhaps done a virtuous act, but will he next time give in to the temptation? Will he find the next necklace to be too irresistible to exist? So you see these differences between these two ethical systems. Criticism of Kant's ethics, alienation. Basically, the ideal is that separating morality from its emotional opinions makes people feel strange. It makes them feel alienated. They, think that there's something wrong. And so alienation, feeling that you're not being yourself, not being authentic. Anyway, that's one criticism. A second criticism is moral minimalism. So Kant's ethics appears to unduly emphasize doing only what is required and not maybe what might be extra. So just doing the minimum. Well, what is it I have to do? What is it I'm required to do? What will satisfy my duty? I'm not going to do any more than that because, I shouldn't have to. Anyway, and so that was a second criticism. And a third criticism is that it's often mistaken as unthinking obedience to authority, just following orders. So a person who says he's following duty ethics might just say, well, I'm only just going to follow orders. As long as I'm following orders, that's fine. I don't have to worry. If my orders are to put the people in this chamber and gas them to death, that's what I'll do because that's my orders. That's my duty, to follow my orders. And I'm not going to question that. I'm not going to challenge that in any sense. I'm just going to comply with my orders. So it's a moral minimalism that sort of qualifies. Okay, that's virtue ethics. That's Kant's duty ethics. We'll look now at utilitarian ethics. Utilitarianism. Utilitarians take a different approach. So Kant's ethics, as we saw, is a very rational system, very much a matter of what's the right thing to do and not doing the wrong thing. And so the values are that you're devoted to doing the right thing, and you've got a set of rules that tells you what the right things are. Oftentimes, you just simply need to look to some authority figure to find out what the right thing is. That's not necessarily the best, though. Anyway, utilitarianism is a different system. Utilitarianism, what you need is a kind of crystal ball. Utilitarian's purpose is to make life more beneficial for all of mankind. Therefore, the utilitarian is less concerned with the actor's intention and more concerned with the consequences of his actions. Okay, so what's the outcome going to be? Well, do you have a crystal ball? So crystal balls, consequences, if we're making our decision based upon what the consequences are going to be, we really need then to have a crystal ball. Now, all of us maybe have some sense of probability. We have an idea that this is if I do this, probably that will happen. And if I do this other thing is going to happen. And so which is the right outcome? So you're letting in the drug dealer. Do you know what's going to happen? Do you know whether he's going to discover your roommate hiding in the cabinet above the sink? Or will he not be able to find him? And of course, if he doesn't find him, then everything maybe will turn out okay. Provided he doesn't come back and catches him later. And on the other hand, if he catches him, then it's going to be terrible, right? So how do you know what the consequences are going to be? And in a way, you maybe are just hoping that it would be. So with Kant, basically it was a rule you didn't tell a lie. So it was very simple to reach your decision point. So both of these systems, utilitarianism and duty ethics, are based upon the ideal of how you should reach your decision. With Kant, you usually have some rules, and you follow the rules. And one of them is, thou shalt not lie. And for Kant, that's a very strict rule. On the other hand, utilitarians are often willing to lie. People with virtue ethics will lie if they think that's the right thing to do. So, they don't think of it in terms, they don't think of lying as being an absolute duty. They would think of, both utilitarians and virtue ethics, people would think of lying as to be the general rule, but not an absolute rule, not something that has to be always followed. Whereas Kant said very clearly that he said there's never a good reason to lie. You always need to respect the other person's autonomy, and therefore you have to do that. And so that's one of his pillars, is autonomy. And the other pillar is responsibility. You've got to be responsible for your decisions under Kant's duty ethics. But with virtue ethics, you're trying to make the best decision, and you're really worried about whether or not you're doing the best you can. So it's more an issue of your character. And some people mistake it for an issue of reputation. It's not so much the reputation as what is your character. How are you going to feel about yourself in the morning? Not what will other people think of yourself, but what will you think about yourself? So that's the true virtue ethics. You're doing it because you want to be of good character, and you want to do the right thing. And it's not a matter of duty, it's a matter of, you just want to be the best person you can. With utilitarians, you're trying to make the best decision based upon what you see as being the outcome. And so maybe you might have some rules that you say, well, most of the time it is better to actually tell the truth to certain people. So you might have a list of people you would tell the truth to almost all the time, and you very, very rarely would ever tell them a lie. So that might, at the top of that list might be your spouse. And very next to that might be your child. Next to that might be your best friend or your parents, or people who are close to you in some ways. One might be your boss. So you would have this rule that generally I'm never ever going to say this. So there has to be an extreme emergency for me to lie to them. And if there is some conflict, that is, if maybe the reason I want to lie is in serving an interest of my own. So for instance, a man who's lying to his wife about an affair he has is a conflicted individual. And he wants to lie to his wife, to preserve the marriage? That's what he tells himself. He says, it's not going to do any good to anybody, and if she divorces me, it's going to be hard on the kids, and it's going to be bad on all of us, and therefore I'll lie, and I just don't never do it again. But without the threat of her, knowing, if he thinks he can get away the next time and the next time and ever after that by lying, then why should he change, you know? So basically, you can see that trying to find out that. So the crystal ball effect would actually somewhat be like that too. A person who is a utilitarian might actually argue that he should lie. So you know, you have that duty. With the duty ethics, you might have, if you're Kant, you have a strict rule that you never lie to anyone because you have to respect their autonomy as an individual, and you just kind of let the ships fall where they may, and you don't lie. With utilitarians, you make this prediction: oh, I can get away with a lie, and it's going to be better for everybody. And is it really? You know, your spouse is living that lie, and if she finds out, it may be irreparable damage. Whereas if you tell the truth, at least maybe the first time, she'll maybe just ask that you don't do it again, and you promise that you won't, and nothing else might come of it. But if she realizes at some point that you've not been honest, then she's going to question, how many times have you done this, and how many times will you do it in the future? Because you thought you could get away with this time, and you didn't. And so, you know, and also, can you really conceal it from her? Or will she somehow suspect it and know, and be very uneasy? And this happens in these kinds of situations where people lie to their spouse. The spouse oftentimes begins to suspect, and the suspicion can drive them crazy and can be a real problem. And is that fair to them? And is it fair for them to have to live with a person who's being dishonest with them and not being true? You can see, would you want somebody doing that to you? Probably not. So if you follow the golden rule, which may be why Kant says you can't lie, because, you know, he wants you to not regret what you do. But on the other hand, like I said, many people believe it's ethical in some situations to lie, to prevent the recapture of a slave or to prevent a criminal from doing something. You know, that, you know, they'll say, well, this person doesn't deserve the truth, can't handle the truth, whatever. And these could be just a dodge, a way of getting around responsibility and not being responsible, which is, of course, Kant's point, that you have to be responsible. That's one of the pillars of ethics, being responsible. Another pillar of ethics is allowing other people's autonomy to rule your relationship with them, allowing them to be their own person and living as they would want to live. If they don't want to live in a sham of a marriage, then you have to respect that, and not try to force them into staying there by tricking them. So consequences require us to look into the future, and you can't always predict the future. The utilitarian undertakes a risky venture when he acts. What if he is wrong? Many issues are either unpredictable or are impossible to calculate. Of course, we can use probability theory at least sometimes. Consequences may be too indefinite and their calculation perhaps too complex. So we have a very rough and ready kind of probability scale in our brain, right? We basically do not calculate odds correctly when we're just relying upon our normal senses, and it's very difficult to come up with numbers to give to calculate the odds in many situations. So life doesn't come oftentimes with numbers to allow us to calculate precisely what the odds are, and we're maybe likely to decide that something is more probable than not because we want it to. So we usually want a certain outcome, and if we want the outcome that she doesn't find out and everything goes fine, then we may overcalculate the possibility that will happen if we lie. And like I said, we're not really then treating her with any respect. We're not taking responsibility when we do that, and there's no autonomy. And that's not a very virtuous act to do. And so by the other two measures, you don't want to lie to your spouse about that. And you know, there are other situations with other people that you also should take very serious, your obligation to tell the truth. As to lying in regard to, say, a joke, it's not a lie. Everybody knows it's a joke. It's not a lie to appear in a stage show and pretend to be somebody you're not. That's just something that we all kind of know, so it's not considered a lie. What's a lie? It's when you intend somebody to mislead somebody, and there is a good possibility that you can get away with it. That's a lie. And it's worse if indeed there's some awful consequence connected to the lying. So are you lying to deceive him and take advantage of him, get some money from him? Or are you lying in a way that's going to cause him hardship and pain in the future? These are all considerations that you have difficulty calculating into any kind of sense in the world itself. So many issues are either unpredictable. So consequences may be too indefinite in the calculation, too complex. You see that life is usually very complex. Lots of black swans, lots of difficult things can happen that can throw you off. You know, can't count on things being always the same way. And best laid plans of mice and men often go astray. So the utilitarian basically claims to be working for the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, that's not really what a lot of utilitarians would claim, but this is something that's often attributed to them. So it does not imply the greatest aggregate good. When if a utilitarian says that, he doesn't mean necessarily the greatest aggregate good. So he's just saying that it's sort of a generalized statement, a simplification of a much more complex process. And it isn't a rigid majoritarian principle. It doesn't entail any averaging. It does not imply an attempt to satisfy human desires, needs, or aspirations. Greatest good for the greatest number. It's not necessarily going to be something that we all aspire to having. Demands of utilitarianism. We should set aside personal interests and treat ourselves as only one of the many. So if you're a utilitarian, you need to stay objective that way and treat others as you would yourself want to be treated, right? We shouldn't be passive, but should do the most for the benefit of all of humanity, maximizing the good for all. And so all is what's important. It's not, oh, the majority that's important. We say it's not a majoritarian rule. It's about the entire population who you owe duty to be honest, truthful, and to do the best for them that you can, and be virtuous, basically. Can't get around that word. Anyway, measuring the good. Utilitarians seek to maximize the good for all humanity and not for themselves alone. The first question then is, how do you determine what is the good that is to be obtained? Is the good some sort of wealth? Is that the good? Is that the only good? Or is that one of the goods? Or is there a multitude of different goods? Is the good happiness? That might be bland. So we'll look at some things that are posited as good by various writers, and say how that's looked on by at least some of the people. First, determine what is a good that is to be obtained. Second, calculate how much good to obtain. So you have difficulty there usually, right? Our rough and ready sense of more probable than not really is difficult to apply when we're actually asked to give a precise number as to what our probabilities are. Oftentimes we're just kind of like giving a generalized ideal that indicates that we either think it's more probable than not, or it's less than probable. And so that's maybe not also good. These would often be an estimate. So if we do calculate, if we even have some way of calculating, even then it's probably going to be an estimate. So, you know, if you're asked to estimate, you can give an estimate, but oftentimes, you know, it's just simply hot air. And you don't really have a basis on which to make an estimate. Oftentimes, you know, life doesn't come with numbers. And in some situations in business and engineering and in some fields, you would maybe have some sort of way of quantifying the probability. But in a lot of areas, you don't have that. There may be undesirable and unintended consequences that can intrude. So everything goes out as you think it will, except that there's some things that you didn't think would happen. You know, these are the black swans. They're not supposed to be there, but they're there sometimes. And so you think you know what's likely to happen, but in fact there might be something that you didn't think would happen, does happen this time, because that's the way life is sometimes. What the good is to be sought. Philosophers have suggested various candidates for the good. So we start, the first utilitarian is said to be Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham was an economist. And he thought that he could measure the good of pleasure, and that this was the good that should be maximized. So he said, well, it's a good, people will have pleasure. This might include all kinds of pleasure. I mean, some people would criticize him for having a pig philosophy, that is, by just looking for pleasure. But in fact, pleasure could come from being virtuous. I mean, but in truth, it's not really specified very much to people, and so people might get the ideal that they could, as long as they're leading a very comfortable life, that's an ethical life. Maybe it's not. Maybe you're not meant to be comfortable. Maybe you're meant to be working to help others and suffering on account of that. Maybe even making sacrifices so others can have a better life is something that is good to do. So Jeremy Bentham, pleasure. He was criticized for that by some people, at least. His nephew, well, not an actual nephew, a man he called his nephew, who was a son of a colleague of him, John Stuart Mill, came up with a different candidate for the good that we should seek when we're talking about utilitarianism. What good should they try to seek and see if they can maximize? Well, according to John Stuart Mills, that good would be happiness, and not just a silly kind of happiness, sometimes maybe a sincere, very substantial kind of happiness. The Greeks would talk about happiness, eudaimonia, as being something that was, being successful and being satisfied with your life, and being much more than just simply having a lot of money or having a great job. But a good life maybe consists of much more than just these material things. And so happiness is what John Stuart Mill. So this is maybe a better formulation than his Uncle Jeremy, who wanted pleasure to be the thing that they would measure and seek as the goal, but is not too ideal. In fact, one of the goods sought by Moore was ideals, that is freedom, justice, truth. These ideals that we oftentimes have, justice, prosperity, ideals, these seem more worthy than, say, pleasure, and certainly more diverse, and it may or may not entail actual happiness, but maybe we ought not to live our lives just to be happy, but maybe we should live our life to have meaning in it and to do something meaningful for others, and that may be the good we should seek, according to G.E. Moore. Kenneth Arrow, he's a true economist here. So we talk about Bentham being an economist. John Stuart Mill was considered an economist, and they were utilitarians. I think G.E. Moore was more of a philosopher. Kenneth Arrow was a more modern economist, and he said that the good to seek is to maximize choice, that is, to maximize preferences, so that people would have their preference. What is it that you want? If you're getting that, then that should be our goal. That would be the good to be sought by people. That would lead to a good life. And so that would be the value that we seek to maximize. Okay, so I talked about Jeremy Bentham and said that critics attacked Bentham's choice of pleasure. They felt that elevating pleasure to the level of the ultimate good denied humanity of its dignity. So you can see a contrast between that and G.E. Moore's suggestion that we take things like freedom and justice as being the goals, the goods that we seek. Besides, pursuit of pleasure is a short-run consequence, since the pleasures are often fleeting and not satisfying or fulfilling. So, every day you've got a challenge to find as much pleasure from as you had the day before, and that can get a little tiresome, you know, and sometimes it gets very tiresome. So you maybe know something that's pleasant. You watch it today, you watch it tomorrow. How many days are you going to watch it before you get tired? And you get maybe tired of it after a while. So pursuit of pleasure is a short-run consequence, since the pleasures are often fleeting and not satisfying or fulfilling. Happiness. Although John Stuart Mill's choice has many supporters, still some say that happiness is too bland to become the goal of our society. So you find it in Charlie Brown and Peanuts characters. Basically, happiness is a warm puppy. Happiness is this, happiness is that. And so it can be very kind of bland and shallow in some ways. But it's certainly better than maybe what Bentham was suggesting. So difficulty also arises in determining what should count as happiness. I mean, when are people happy? Is it being happy if you're satisfied with your life and think that you've got a good life? Or does happiness require you to be entertained? And if you find yourself getting bored, that means you're unhappy. And I think people have a difficulty saying whether they're happy or not. They may have different definitions of what it is that happiness is. Are you happy if you've got enough money to get you through life? So it's oh, well, I'm set for life. Does that make you happy? Is money going to make you happy? Having a lot of money or enough money, is that really the thing that's going to take you through to true happiness? And maybe not. And so that's maybe a little too bland, but it certainly is an ideal, and certainly is maybe one of the things that we should consider. Ideals. So these ideals such as justice, freedom, and truth are more reflective of what is good in man's nature. Main difficulty, deciding on what is justice and truth. So what constitutes justice? Is justice that something found by the juries in these courtrooms? Or is it something that's dished out by the Supreme Court? Lots of people are unhappy with the decisions that they get from juries and unhappy with decisions that come down from the Supreme Court. And so is that really justice? That's man's justice, perhaps. Divine justice. Or can we guarantee that you'll get divine justice, which would be the justice that the all-knowing and good God would give you? Hopefully you will get that when you're in heaven, but on earth your justice is going to be dispensed by man in our courtrooms. And is it just that one man take away from work millions of dollars, whereas the men who are working under him take away just a few thousands of dollars? And is that disparity? Is that just? Did he really make that big a contribution to producing those products? And how much did they deserve credit for what they produced as opposed to his takeaway? And so the main difficulty is deciding on what is justice, what is truth. We'd have similar kind of problems. Deciding what is truth, what constitutes the truth, like I say. What constitutes freedom. So, some people say freedom, you don't have freedom unless you have a certain amount of money. And other people say, well, you're free if you don't let things bother you. Are either one of those free? Can a slave be free and a master basically unfree? What is freedom? So that's the difficulty. So that might be a hard goal to achieve because people might have different understanding of what being free means. And maybe it's a high level, maybe it's a low level. Also, since these ideals are highly abstract, it may lead to manipulation by people saying, well, you've got freedom, or you've gotten justice, or you had a trial, and they found you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury found you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. You say it wasn't a fair trial, but you got an appeal, and you lost the appeal. Well, that's too bad. but maybe you were guilty. And is that justice? And we know that sometimes people have been sent away to jail because of the, we did a few years back, we had a DNA, strategy. They went in and they found numerous, usually black prisoners in prison for horrible crimes, rape and other things, in which the DNA had been present, and these people were convicted based upon the DNA evidence, even though the evidence wasn't really all that good at the time. And since new techniques have come in, and basically these new techniques would eliminate these people from being found guilty, and so it was used to actually free a lot of prisoners because of the inadequate measure. And so DNA was thought to be a great thing, is that it would come up with the right person, but it wasn't perfect, at least at the time that they initially introduced it. And even now, it can go wrong. It has to be administered the right way, and the people doing that DNA testing have to know what they're doing, and the lab results have to be untampered with. And so it's a problem. Trials are just man's justice and can sometimes go wrong. And apparently, in our society, there has been a long history of blacks being unjustly imprisoned and found guilty for things they didn't, sometimes being lynched. And so that's justice. Even under the best of circumstances, with beyond a reasonable doubt and representation by an attorney, a person might be convicted. Is it just, if he didn't do it, that he winds up serving 20 years or swinging by his neck until he's done, dead, or being fried in the electric chair? Is that just? And so freedom, like I said, what is freedom? Are you free if you are able to make a good living for your family, but you have to work 2 jobs, and you have literally no time to yourself, and the bosses just simply tell you what to do, and you have no choice on how you do your work, under what conditions you do your work. Very limited, except for extreme conditions. Maybe you can't complain if you have to work out in the cold, or they give you salt, or they give you some chemicals to put on a sidewalk, and you go and you put it on and your hands become cracked, and so the next day you use gloves and your gloves get destroyed by these chemicals that they purchased for you to basically clean the walkway going into the restaurant or store, or even a plant, maybe a bank. And so I've had experience with that. And is that freedom to have that kind of a job? And what is truth? Like I said, do juries come back with the truth? We treat their decisions as being final and as being a fact, but are they really a fact? They're a legal fact. And so we as a society have to recognize them as legal facts, and then we have to follow whatever the legislature finds as being the rules, and they get the final say in that. And the Supreme Court makes its judgment, oftentimes based on theories, which may not be agreed to by all the people. So historians do not believe, most historians that I've done some investigation into have basically been saying, when they get to original intent, that they didn't think there was something called original intent, because different founders apparently had different intent. And why do you think that, what would you think that maybe the common people all were united in what they thought was their intent in adopting the measures that we call the Constitution? Were they more, is our intent more in actually the Declaration of Independence, which kind of speaks to our aspiration and our ideals, whereas the Constitution doesn't really guarantee us certain rights, and was thought to only restrain the federal government at first, and that people would get protection from their state constitutions. And so, is that a true kind of freedom that we have? So, main difficulty is deciding on what is justice, truth, and what constitutes freedom. Also, since these ideals are highly abstract, it may lead to manipulation, where somebody says, well, of course we have freedom. Okay, Okay, we're going to end this now because we're having some technical problems with the camera, and I want to just say goodbye, and we'll finish up on the next one that's due on Monday.